On the 5th of November, 1995, a small television crew carried their equipment piece by piece through a side entrance of Kensington Palace on a Sunday chosen because most of the household staff would be away. They set up a single camera in a first floor sitting room and waited. The woman who came in to sit before it was 34 years old. She wore a dark suit and heavy dark eyeliner, and she had told almost no one she was doing this, not the palace, not her private secretary, not the queen. She answered the questions in a low, steady voice, her hands folded in her lap. And when the interviewer asked her about her husband and about the other woman whose name had shadowed her since before the wedding, she said quietly that there had been 3 of them in the marriage. 2 weeks later, some 23 million people in Britain watched her say it. What none of them could see was how long the institution around her had known, and how hard it had worked to keep them from knowing that the most photographed marriage in the world had been, almost from the start, a quiet arrangement dressed as a love match, and that the people meant to protect her had spent years protecting appearances instead. This is the story of the marriage behind that confession, how it was arranged, how it failed, and how an institution kept smiling for the cameras while it came apart. It runs for 16 years and ends in a Paris underpass, and it leaves 2 boys to carry what the adults could not. It is a story about what was hidden and about who paid for the hiding. To understand how a marriage sold to the world as the romance of the century became one of the most exhaustively documented private collapses in modern British history, you have to go back, not to the courtship and not even to the first meeting, but to the 2 families who made these people, and to the codes those families lived by long before a wedding was ever discussed. This is not, in the end, a story about one unhappy marriage. It is a story about 2 old British systems, one constitutional and one aristocratic, that agreed without ever quite saying so that the way a thing looked mattered more than the way it felt. The House of Windsor was built on duty, containment, and the unbroken continuity of the crown. The Spencer family was older than the throne it served, grand and landed and emotionally fractured in ways the public would not learn about for decades. When those 2 systems were joined in the summer of 1981 in front of an estimated 750 million people, the world believed it was watching a fairy tale. What it was actually watching was a 32-year-old heir with a prior attachment he had never fully surrendered, marrying a 19-year-old who was suitable, photogenic, and young enough to be molded into the role. That gap that's between the picture and the fact film is the engine of everything that followed. Begin with the older of the 2 houses, because the monarchy is where the rules came from. By the time Charles reached the age at which an heir was expected to settle, the British monarchy had spent the better part of a century learning a single lesson very well, that it survived by managing its image. It had come through the abdication crisis of 1936, when a king gave up the throne for a divorced woman and very nearly broke the institution in the process. It had come through a world war in which the crown became a symbol of national endurance. It had come through the loss of an empire and the arrival of television, which turned the family at the top of British life into something that could be watched, judged, and consumed in every living room in the country. The monarchy had survived all of it by becoming expert in a particular kind of performance, visible, dignified, emotionally legible from a distance, and almost completely opaque up close. The reigning sovereign, Elizabeth II, had built her entire reign on that discipline. Duty was not a word the family used lightly. It was the organizing principle of every life inside it. Charles was born into that machine at Buckingham Palace on the 14th of November, 1948. From the moment of his birth, he was not simply a child. He was an heir, the future of an institution, a constitutional fact wrapped in an infant's blanket. He was educated first in London, then sent to Cheam, then to Gordonstoun in the north of Scotland, a school chosen for its emphasis on cold endurance and character-building hardship, and for a term to Timbertop in Australia. He became the first heir to the British throne to take a university degree at Cambridge, and he was invested as Prince of Wales at Caernarfon Castle on the 1st of July 1969 in a piece of medieval pageantry staged for the cameras of the modern age. In public, he was continuity itself. In private, by the account of nearly every serious biographer, he was a more sensitive and inward figure than the role allowed. A boy raised in a family culture that prized reserve over warmth, that taught its children that difficulty was to be borne rather than discussed, and that treated open feeling as a kind of weakness. He grew into a man who was intelligent, cultivated, serious about ideas and landscapes and architecture, and capable of appearing remote even to the people closest to him. What he wanted was never quite the thing the fairy tale promised. He did not want, above all, to be adored. He wanted to be understood. There is something worth sitting with in the texture of that upbringing, because it shaped every decision Charles would later make about love. His parents were not unkind, but they were not present in the way the modern world understands the word. The Queen's duties came first, always, and the children were raised substantially by nannies and by the rhythms of the institution. Charles was a soft, anxious boy in a family that valued hardness, and the school chosen for him, Gordonstown, cold and Spartan and built on the idea that character was forged through discomfort, was by his own later accounts a kind of misery he endured rather than a place he belonged. The one figure who seemed to understand him, who treated the boy as a person with an inner life rather than a constitutional asset, was his great uncle, Lord Louis Mountbatten. Mountbatten was mentor, confidant, and substitute father, the man Charles turned to for advice on everything, including women. And in the summer of 1979, 2 years before the wedding, Mountbatten was murdered, killed by an Irish Republican bomb planted on his fishing boat off the coast of County Sligo, along with members of his family. Charles was 30 years old, and he had lost the one person who had ever made the role feel survivable. He grieved privately and with a depth those around him did not fully see. He was, in other words, a man already carrying loss and already starved of intimacy when the institution began to press him hardest to choose a bride. The Spencer side of the story came from a different but adjacent corner of the same British world. The Spencers were not royalty, but in some respects they were older and more securely rooted in the English land than the family they would marry into. Their seat was Althorpe in Northamptonshire, a house the family had held for more than 5 centuries, set in an estate of roughly 13,000 acres. The Spencer name carried old prestige and a long intimacy with royal circles. Spencers had served the crown, lived near it, married around it for generations. This was hereditary credibility of exactly the kind the palace valued when it began, in the late 1970s, to think seriously about who the Prince of Wales might be permitted to marry. A bride from such a family would not be a parvenu. She would be one of their own, drawn from the small, closed world of the British aristocracy, where everyone knew everyone, where the same names recurred at the same shooting weekends and the same London balls, and where breeding was understood to be a form of qualification. Diana Frances Spencer was born into that world on the 1st of July 1961 at Park House, a property on the Queen's Sandringham estate that the Spencers leased from the Crown. Her childhood looked from the outside like privilege of the most unassailable kind, a great family, a great house in waiting, proximity to the monarchy, the whole apparatus of English upper-class life. But the privilege was not the same thing as security, and this is the first place where the public version of Diana and the private one diverge. Her parents' marriage was failing. Her mother, Frances, left when Diana was a small child, and the divorce that followed was bitter, public by the standards of the family, and decided in a way that left the children largely in the care of their father. There was a custody battle. There was, by several accounts, the spectacle, the stepmom of Diana's maternal grandmother giving evidence against her own daughter. Diana grew up in a house marked by absence, a mother gone, a father often distant, a sense that the adults around her were managing an arrangement rather than building a home. She was sent away to school, to Riddlesworth Hall and then to West Heath, and later to a finishing school in Switzerland. She was not academic. What she had instead was an unusual intuition for people, an instinct for warmth and for reading a room, and underneath all of it a fear of abandonment that had been laid down early and would never entirely leave her. The detail Diana herself returned to, when she described that childhood in later life, was a sound. The crunch of car wheels on gravel on the night her mother left, the noise of a departure she was too young to understand and too young to stop. She remembered the crying of her younger brother through a bedroom wall. She remembered being a child in an enormous house where the adults had stopped loving one another and no one explained why. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being privileged and unwanted at the same time, and Diana knew it intimately before she was 10 years old. The custody fight that followed was uglier than the family ever let the public see. Her maternal grandmother, Ruth, Lady Fermoy, gave evidence on the side of Diana's father against her own daughter, and that same grandmother was a close friend and lady-in-waiting to the Queen Mother. That connection is not incidental. It places a Spencer relative inside the royal household years before any marriage. And when the question of a bride for Charles became urgent, Ruth Fermoy and the Queen Mother were, by several accounts, quietly encouraging the match between the families they both served. The marriage that the world would receive as destiny was, in part, arranged by two grandmothers who moved in the same small rooms of the same closed world. She had rank. She did not have armor. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in this story. By the time she came to the attention of the palace, Diana was a shy young woman living in a flat in Earl's Court, with friends and working as an assistant at the Young England kindergarten in Pimlico. She had received the style Lady Diana Spencer in 1975, when her father inherited the earldom and became the 8th Earl Spencer. On paper, she was close to ideal, for the role being quietly contemplated for her. Aristocratic, Anglican, unmarried, English, young, and this word recurs in the accounts of the time, and it carried a specific institutional meaning. Without a past, she had no history that could embarrass the crown. She was 19 years old. There is a blunt way of describing what the institution wanted from a young woman in that position, and it is worth stating plainly, even though no official document ever recorded it in those terms. The monarchy needed a wife for its heir who was suitable, presentable, and untroubling, who could produce children and stand on a balcony and absorb the attention of the cameras without complication. Whether the men who arranged these things ever consciously thought of her as a vessel for the succession is something no record proves. But the shape of what they wanted is not in dispute. They wanted a role filled. She thought she was walking into a love story. The two dynasties were also unequal in a way that would matter enormously once the marriage was underway, and the difference was structural rather than personal. Charles belonged to the crown. He came with an apparatus, residences, private secretaries, staff, advisors, the whole constitutional machinery of monarchy that existed independently of any wife and would survive any wife. Diana belonged to a great aristocratic house with land and lineage and old ties, but she did not belong to the sovereign machinery itself. When she married into it, she did not gain a share of that protection. She gained visibility. She gained the most photographed life in the world, and eventually an extraordinary reservoir of public sympathy, but she had far less structural cover than the man she married. He always had the institution to fall back on. She had charisma and the affection of strangers. The difference between standing near the throne and being absorbed into it is the difference that made her so powerful in public and so exposed in private at the very same time. These lives unfolded in houses built to look eternal, and the houses themselves are part of the story. Althorpe was the Spencer emotional landscape. Vast, ancient, beautiful, and lonely. The kind of place where a child could be both surrounded by grandeur and starved of warmth. Highgrove, the house in Gloucestershire that Charles bought in 1980, and the rooms and routines of St. James's Palace were his adult terrain, settled long before Diana and in some sense never fully reorganized to make room for her. Kensington Palace, which would later become the base of her own household, would function as both a refuge and a stage set. None of these places was merely a backdrop. Each was an instrument of hierarchy, of separation, of performance. People in this world did not simply live in their houses, they were arranged by them, and the values of both families pointed in the same direction, which is precisely why the collision was so total. Discretion, endurance, marriage understood as social structure first and emotional bond second. Children understood as succession and stability. Public composure valued above private clarity. Silence maintained until silence became impossible. Charles needed a wife who could fit the role and a companion who already understood him. Diana needed love, reassurance, exclusivity, and the family warmth she had never reliably had. Those were not the same needs, and the institution that brought them together was not built to notice the difference. By every account, the people arranging the match were thinking about suitability. Almost no one was thinking about compatibility. The seeds of the catastrophe were planted before the couple had spent any real time alone together. Now, the principal figures, because in a story this size, the audience has to understand each of them as an individual rather than a name attached to a scandal. Charles should not be drawn as a villain. He was a man made narrow by duty and by his own emotional history. Heir from childhood, trained for service, taught that private desire must always negotiate with role. He was capable of real seriousness and real feeling, and also of a stubborn loyalty to attachments formed before duty closed in. What he needed was not romance in the storybook sense. It was understanding, continuity, a private language with someone who had known him before the cameras. In this story, that person was Camilla. Diana should be introduced as both extraordinary and catastrophically unsuited to what was coming. She was emotionally porous in a world that rewarded armor. Her gifts were spontaneity, empathy, and almost physical ability to connect with people she had never met, and a star quality that the camera found and never let go of. Her needs were love, exclusivity, reassurance, and a family of her own that would not fracture the way the first one had. Those gifts made her one of the most beloved women on earth. They also made her, inside the institution, profoundly difficult, because a consort was supposed to support the performance, not become a more compelling performance in her own right. She was 19 when this began. She had no idea what she was about to be asked to carry. Camilla must be more than the other woman, because reducing her to that misses the whole point of why she mattered. She was born Camilla Rosemary Shand in 1947, the daughter of Major Bruce Shand and Rosalind Cubitt, and she belonged entirely to the same upper-class English world as Charles. She had been part of his orbit since the early 1970s. She married Andrew Parker Bowles, a cavalry officer, in 1973. But by every serious account, Charles's attachment to her never genuinely ended. What Camilla offered him was the thing Diana, through no fault of her own, could not. She knew exactly who he was when he was not performing the Prince of Wales, and she did not need him to be anything other than that. She was comfortable, unintimidated, familiar. That is precisely what made her so threatening to a young wife who needed to be the only one, and what made her indispensable to the man at the center of the story. There is a generational echo here worth pausing on, because it tells you something about the world these people moved in. Camilla's great-grandmother was Alice Keppel, the celebrated mistress of King Edward VII in the years before the First World War, a woman who occupied the position of royal favorite with such discretion and social skill that she was tolerated, even respected, by the establishment of her day. The story in Camilla's family, passed down and reportedly mentioned by Camilla herself in her youth, was that an ancestor had loved a king. In the upper reaches of British life, the role of the king's companion was not a scandal to be hidden so much as an arrangement to be managed quietly, the legitimate wife and the loved woman occupying separate, understood places. That older code, that a man in Charles's position might be expected to make a suitable marriage while keeping his heart elsewhere, was very nearly the assumption Charles inherited. It was an assumption that belonged to a vanished century. Diana, raised on a more modern idea of marriage as love and exclusivity, had no intention of living inside it. The collision between those two understandings of what a marriage even was would prove as destructive as any single act of betrayal. Queen Elizabeth II sits at the silent center of the whole thing, not as a melodramatic antagonist, micromanaging the bedroom, but as the embodiment of the monarchy's central bargain, which was that individual discomfort could be borne so long as continuity was preserved. The culture formed around her reign prized restraint, durability, and the visible stability of the crown above almost everything else. She mattered not because she interfered in every intimate detail, but because the entire emotional climate around her made distress look like a problem to be contained rather than a wound to be tended. Prince Philip belongs beside her as the family's voice of stoic endurance, the figure through whom the doctrine that difficulty is to be managed rather than endlessly discussed was most forcefully expressed. That emotional grammar, common to the whole family, helps explain why Diana's suffering, when it came, could be read inside those walls as instability, rather than as a signal that something was genuinely wrong. John Spencer, the 8th Earl, and Frances Shandkid, Diana's parents, matter because Diana's emotional life began in their marriage and in its collapse. The custody struggle and the absence that followed were the prehistory of her fear of abandonment, and that backstory was not a sad footnote, but load-bearing. Diana did not emerge from a serene aristocratic nursery. She came from a house that had already broken once. Her siblings carry their own threads. Her elder sister, Lady Sarah, matters because it was while Charles was seeing Sarah in 1977 that he first encountered the 16-year-old Diana. Her sister, Lady Jane, became part of the intimate family infrastructure around her and was married to a senior palace courtier, which placed a Spencer inside the very institution the family would later find itself at war with. And her younger brother, Charles, who would become the 9th Earl Spencer, matters first as the boy closest to her in age and later as the keeper of Althorpe, the outraged voice of the family, and the man who would deliver one of the most extraordinary public speeches of the entire saga. The two children who do not yet exist when the marriage begins, William and Harry, are the spine of the story's long second half, and they belong in it from the start as a promise. They would be born to secure a dynasty and would spend their lives living in the wreckage of how it was secured. And at the edges of the story stand the three men who would turn a private collapse into a public war: Andrew Morton, whose book would detonate in 1992; Jonathan Dimbleby, whose authorized project would give Charles his chance to explain himself; and Martin Bashir, whose deception in obtaining one famous interview would not be fully exposed for another quarter of a century. They do not belong to the beginning, but they are coming, because once the private truth of this marriage began to leak into print and onto television, the marriage stopped being a private matter and became something the institution could no longer control. Here's this simple and brutal fact underneath all these characters: every one of them wanted something slightly incompatible with what the institution required. Charles wanted understanding without rupture. Diana wanted love without having to share it. Camilla wanted Charles without being publicly devoured for it. The monarchy wanted continuity without scandal. And the children, when they came, would want parents rather than symbols. No one in this story could have everything they wanted. Most of them, in the end, got almost none of it. So now to the meeting, because the courtship has to be written vividly enough that the later loss actually hurts. Charles first met Diana in November 1977 at Althorpe, while he was involved with her elder sister Sarah. Diana was 16, still at school, and by her own later telling unremarkable to him in that moment, a younger sister in the background of a country weekend. The relationship that mattered did not begin until the summer of 1980, after years in which Charles had failed, conspicuously and to mounting public impatience, to settle into an approved marriage. He was past 30. The press had spent the better part of a decade speculating about every woman near him. The pressure to choose was real and institutional. And when Diana reappeared, older now, 19, charming, well-born, and untouched by scandal, she made immediate structural sense in a way that had nothing to do with whether the two of them were suited to one another. She was right on paper. The courtship was brief and conducted under siege. Photographers found her at the kindergarten. She was tested in the way such young women were tested in that world, for suitability rather than for love. It is worth understanding what Britain itself was like in the months this courtship unfolded, because the country's hunger for the story was part of what made the story unstoppable. The early 1980s were not gentle years. There was recession and unemployment climbing toward 3 million, and rioting in English cities in the summer of 1981. The nation was tired and divided and looking for something to feel good about, and into that mood walked a shy 19-year-old with a downward glance the cameras adored, paired with the future king. The press did not merely cover her, it fell upon her. Reporters and photographers camped outside her flat and her kindergarten, and one of the enduring images of that winter was Diana standing in a thin skirt with the sun behind her, the light revealing more than she had intended, smiling helplessly because she did not yet know how to disappear. She was learning, in real time and in public, that her life was no longer her own. She had not married into the role yet. The role had already started to consume her. And the institution watching from inside the palace wall saw a young woman who photographed beautifully and complained little and concluded that she would do. The engagement was announced on the 24th of February 1981, and it produced the single most telling foreshadowing beat of the entire story, a moment whose horror only becomes visible in hindsight. Standing before the television cameras with his bride-to-be, asked whether they were in love, Diana answered without hesitation that of course they were, and Charles, beside her, added a qualification that has echoed ever since: whatever in love means. He may have meant it as the awkward intellectual hedge of a man uncomfortable with sentiment in public. He may have meant something colder. There is no need to decide for him. The line simply sits in the air because the 19-year-old standing beside him heard it, and because it would turn out to be the most honest sentence spoken by anyone in the whole courtship. What happened in the 5 months between that engagement and the wedding has been told many times, but the private version is harder and more telling than the public one. Diana moved into palace apartments and began to be prepared for the role, and she began almost at once to come apart. By her own later account, her bulimia began in this period, first appearing, she said, within a week of the engagement, a body turning its distress inward because there was nowhere else for the distress to go. She was a young woman who had been the center of a love story for a matter of weeks and was already sensing that she was not the center of anything. There was the matter of a bracelet and a piece of jewelry Charles had commissioned, engraved with initials, that Diana discovered and understood, rightly or wrongly, to be intended for Camilla. There was the unsettling experience of being assessed, of feeling that Camilla was somehow present in the vetting of her own suitability, a woman who seemed to know more about her fiancé's life than she did. Deanna later described the days before her wedding as among the worst of her life and said she had seriously considered calling it off and that her sisters had half joked that it was too late, that her face was already on the tea towels. There is something almost unbearable in that image of a teenager in a palace, sick with a secret illness, being told that the merchandise had already been printed. What the public saw in the months that followed was a fairy tale assembling itself in real time. What was actually true was that the heir to the throne was about to marry a young woman he barely knew, while the woman he had never stopped loving remained quietly within reach. The country was preparing to watch a wedding it would remember for the rest of its life, and the bride, only just beginning to understand the role she had agreed to, was already sensing, in the small print of an engagement, in a bracelet, in a name that kept recurring, that the field she had married into had never been cleared. The fairy tale had not begun. The cover story had. There is one more thing to hold on to before the wedding arrives because it frames everything that follows. The people arranging this marriage were not monsters, and it does the story no service to pretend they were. They were operating a system that had worked in its own terms for a very long time. A system in which suitable marriages were made, heirs were produced, private feeling was subordinated to public function, and the whole apparatus rolled on through whatever unhappiness it generated, because the unhappiness of individuals had always been considered a survivable cost of continuity. What none of them reckoned with was that the young woman they had selected for her pliability would turn out to be one of the most instinctively gifted communicators of her age, and that the age itself, the age of the close up, the tabloid, the television confessional, would hand her the tools to refuse the role she had been cast in. They thought they were filling a vacancy. They had, in fact, lit a fuse. If this story has you as captivated as I think it has, do subscribe. What happened next to this family is something the public never knew, and we're only just beginning. On the 29th of July, 1981, the cover story became, for a single luminous day, indistinguishable from the truth, at least to everyone watching, which was most of the planet. The wedding took place not at Westminster Abbey, the traditional setting, but at St. Paul's Cathedral, chosen for its greater size and the longer, more cinematic processional route it offered. An estimated 750 million people in 74 countries watched. The dress, designed by David and Elizabeth Emanuel, was a confection of ivory silk taffeta with a train 25 feet long, so vast that it crushed inside the glass coach on the way to the cathedral and had to be smoothed back into shape on the steps. Diana wore the Spencer family tiara rather than a royal one, a small detail that said something about the two dynasties meeting as near equals. She was 20 years old. As she made her vows, she stumbled over the order of Charles's names, pledging herself to Philip Charles Arthur George rather than Charles Philip, and the slip was broadcast to the world and received indulgently as the charming nerves of a young bride. On the balcony of Buckingham Palace afterward, prompted by the crowd, they kissed, and the photograph of that kiss became one of the most reproduced images of the century. It was sold openly and successfully as the wedding of the century, the fairy tale made real, a renewal of the monarchy and a tonic for a troubled country. To stand on the route that morning was to feel the whole nation lean toward a single point. Crowds had slept on the pavements of London for days to hold their places along the Mall and Ludgate Hill. Flags hung from every building. The bride traveled to St. Paul's in the glass coach with her father, the 8th Earl Spencer, beside her, a man still recovering from a stroke that had nearly killed him, who walked her up that immense aisle slowly and with visible effort, leaning on his daughter as much as she leaned on him. The aisle itself ran for 3.5 minutes of measured walking under the great dome, past 3,500 guests, past the cameras, past the assembled heads of state and crowned heads of Europe. There were trumpets, there was an orchestra, and 3 choirs. The Archbishop of Canterbury told the congregation, in a phrase that would be quoted for decades and would curdle horribly in hindsight, that this was the stuff of which fairy tales are made. And for that one morning, almost no one in the watching world doubted him. The splendor is worth dwelling on, not yet for the sake of irony, but for the sake of what it bought: belief. The public believed it completely, and the believing is what would make the later collapse a tragedy, rather than merely a mess. Hundreds of millions of people looked at that day and saw love. What they could not see was that the honeymoon, which followed aboard the royal yacht Britannia in the Mediterranean, was already shadowed. By Diana's own later account, Camilla's presence haunted it. There were photographs that fell from a diary, cufflinks engraved with entwined initials that Charles wore, conversations that returned again and again to a woman who was not aboard the ship but somehow always in the cabin. Diana's bulimia worsened on that honeymoon. She was a young wife on what should have been the happiest voyage of her life, being sick in private and trying to understand why her husband seemed to be somewhere else, even when he was beside her. What is not in dispute is that she had no one to tell. She was 20 years old, freshly married, on a yacht crewed by men loyal to the crown, surrounded by staff who served the institution rather than her, with no mother nearby and no friend she could pull aside. The loneliness of those weeks was a particular kind. The loneliness of being adored by hundreds of millions of strangers and unseen by the one person whose attention she had married for. Charles read and painted and invited a clutch of his friends to join part of the voyage so that the conversation could turn to the books and ideas he loved. While his young bride sat at dinners, she could not follow and was sick afterwards in private. She had everything the fairy tale promised and almost nothing she had actually wanted. By the time the Britannia docked and the couple returned to begin their public life together, the pattern of the entire marriage had already been set. His world, her isolation, and a smile arranged for the cameras over the top of both. And yet the early years produced something genuine too. And the truth of that matters, because a marriage that was only ever misery would not have wounded the way this one did. There was tenderness in the beginning. There was the possibility, never quite realized, of something working. And there were the children who arrived quickly and changed everything. William was born at St. Mary's Hospital, Paddington, on the 21st of June, 1982. The first heir to the throne born in a hospital rather than a palace. A small modernity that hinted at how Diana intended to do things differently. Harry followed on the 15th of September, 1984. Diana threw herself into motherhood with an intensity that broke royal convention at every turn. She insisted on being hands-on, on doing the school runs herself where she could, on hugging her sons in public, on taking the infant William with them on the long tour of Australia and New Zealand in 1983 rather than leaving him behind as protocol expected. She wanted her children to know warmth, precisely because she had grown up without enough of it. There is something to sit within that. The wound from her own childhood became, in the nursery, a kind of gift to her sons. The births themselves carried small signs of the contest already underway. When William was born, there was the matter of his names and his future, the immediate weight of succession settling onto an infant of a few hours old, the second in line to the throne, the child whose existence stabilized an entire constitutional order. Diana wanted to mother him the way an ordinary devoted woman would, and she fought quietly and persistently for the right to do so, to breastfeed, to keep him near, to bring him on tour. When Harry arrived 2 years later, the family was, by Diana's later account, already strained to breaking, and she described the time around his birth as the last period in which she and Charles were genuinely close. There is a quiet devastation in the order of those two births. The first arriving into a marriage that still held a little hope, the second into one that was already letting go. The two boys would grow up to embody, almost schematically, the roles the monarchy assigns, the heir and the spare, the one shaped for the throne and the one shaped by everything around it. But in those first years, they were simply small children, loved hard by a mother who was coming apart in a house where their father was increasingly absent and increasingly elsewhere. That Australian tour in the spring of 1983 was, in public terms, a triumph beyond anything the monarchy had seen in a generation. Enormous crowds turned out, and they turned out for Diana. They chanted her name. When the royal couple worked opposite sides of a street, the groans of disappointment from the side that got Charles were audible. She was 21 years old, and she had become, almost overnight, the most famous and most photographed woman in the world. And here, inside the very triumph, was the first structural fault made visible. Charles had been raised to believe that public life was service, that the attention belonged to the role and the institution rather than to the person. He watched his young wife eclipse him on a global stage, and by several accounts, he did not know how to feel about it. And what he felt was not only pride. The thing that made Diana an extraordinary asset to the monarchy, that the cameras and the crowds adored her, was the same thing that made her destabilizing inside it. She was not behaving like a consort who supported the performance. She had become the performance. And no one, least of all Charles, had been prepared for that. What Diana did with that power, in the years when the marriage was quietly failing, deserves to be understood on its own terms, because it is the other half of who she was. She was not merely a woman who attracted crowds. She had an instinct, almost unteachable, for the gesture that closed the distance between royalty and ordinary suffering. The defining example came in April 1987 at the opening of a ward at Middlesex Hospital, when Diana shook the hand of a man dying of AIDS without gloves in full view of the press at a moment when much of the public believed the disease could be caught through touch and many treated its sufferers as untouchable. It was a small physical act. It was also one of the most consequential gestures of public compassion of the decade, and it did more to change British attitudes toward the disease than any government campaign. She understood, in a way the institution never quite did, that the monarchy's power was not in its distance, but in its capacity to confer dignity through nearness. The cruel symmetry of the story is that her gift for reaching the wounded grew sharper as her own wounds deepened. She was at her most luminous in public during the years she was most desperate in private. The reservoir of love she could not find at home she poured out to strangers, and they loved her back with an intensity that the palace found increasingly difficult to manage. The palace geography of the marriage tells the rest of the story without a word of dialogue. Diana built her life and her household increasingly around Kensington Palace in West London, close to the crowds and the charities and the public life that energized her. Charles remained rooted in the older rhythms of St. James's Palace and of Highgrove, his house in Gloucestershire, with its gardens and its causes and its circle of old friends, a world that predated Diana and never fully reorganized itself to include her. These were not merely logistical arrangements. They were two emotional countries drifting apart, and the children moved between them like small diplomats carrying messages neither parent wanted to hear. Diana's power was direct, popular, modern, drawn from her connection to ordinary people. Charles's was older, institutional, mediated through advisors and tradition and habit. They were not only mismatched as people, they were running on incompatible systems. The cracks beneath the surface widened through the middle of the decade, and they widened first and inside Diana's body and mind, because that is where she had learned to put pain she could not speak. After William's birth, she suffered severe postnatal depression, and she described later a period of genuine desperation that the family around her seemed to read as hysteria rather than illness. The bulimia continued. There was self-harm. There was at least one episode while she was pregnant with William in which she fell or threw herself down a staircase at Sandringham in front of the Queen. A cry, by her own account, not a true attempt. The act of a young woman who could find no other way to make the people around her understand that she was drowning. And the institutional response to all of this was the response the family knew how to give. Distress was contained. It was medicated where necessary, managed where possible, and above all, kept out of view. Diana was made to feel that her suffering was the problem, that she was the difficulty in the marriage rather than a person being harmed by it. By every account, what she needed in those years was for someone to believe her and help her. What she received was the suggestion that she should pull herself together. It would be a failure of the story to render Charles only as the absent husband, because he was suffering too in the muffled way the family permitted. He had married a woman he barely knew under enormous institutional pressure, and he discovered that he could not reach her and she could not settle, and he had no language for any of it. He had been raised in the same emotional silence that was now failing his wife. He retreated into the things that gave him a sense of self: his gardens, his architecture, his charitable work, his correspondence, the company of people who did not require anything of him that he did not know how to give. He was not a cruel man. He was a constrained one, married to someone whose needs he experienced as a kind of weather he could not control, drawn back again and again toward the one relationship in his life that asked nothing of him but understanding. That does not excuse the betrayal at the center of the marriage. It complicates it. Two people who had each grown up starved of warmth were now starving each other, neither of them equipped to name the thing that was wrong, both of them turning elsewhere because the marriage itself had become unbearable. There were no villains in that house. There were only two people drowning in different rooms. Meanwhile, the thing she had feared from the beginning was becoming real again. By the mid-1980s, by most serious accounts, Charles's relationship with Camilla had resumed in earnest. The emotional field had never been cleared, and now it was actively occupied. For Diana, this was not an abstract humiliation or a vague jealousy. It was the confirmation of the thing she had sensed on her honeymoon and at her engagement, that she had married into an arrangement in which the past remained the present in which the loved woman and the legitimate wife occupied separate understood places, exactly as the old vanished code had always intended. Diana, in turn, sought warmth where she could find it, and in the late 1980s, she began a relationship with James Hewitt, a cavalry officer who taught her to ride and who would, years later, sell his version of the story. The marriage by this point was not a partnership coming under strain. It was two lonely people living parallel lives under one of the most famous roofs in the world, each seeking elsewhere what the other could not give. While the public still believed it was watching the great romance of the age, a scene from those years tells it better than any summary. At Highgrove, Charles had built a life that suited him. The walled gardens he tended with genuine devotion, the agricultural causes, the circle of older settled friends who shared his references and his rhythms, and never far away, Camilla, who lived nearby and moved through that world as if she had always belonged to it, which in a sense she had. Diana, when she was there, was the visitor in her own marriage, a young woman who did not care for the country pursuits and the shooting weekends and the conversation that assumed a shared history she had not been part of. She would retreat. He would not follow. The house that should have been their shared home was, in truth, his world, with a place set for her at the table. And 100 miles away in Kensington, Diana built the opposite, a household organized around her sons, her charities, her staff who adored her telephone, her long conversation with the friends who were keeping her afloat. Two houses, two courts, two stories about the same marriage, each being quietly prepared for the day it would have to be told in public. And then, in the summer of 1992, the private truth detonated into public knowledge in a way that could never be undone. The instrument was a book. Andrew Morton, a journalist, published Diana, her true story, in June of that year, and it reported in unsparing detail the things the public had never been allowed to see: the bulimia, the suicidal despair, the loneliness, the suffocating presence of Camilla, the sense of a young woman abandoned inside the most envied marriage on earth. The palace reacted with denial. Friends were wheeled out to dismiss it. The official position was that this was intrusive, exaggerated, the work of an opportunist. What the palace did not know, it's what almost no one knew until after her death, was that Diana herself was the book's secret source, that she had recorded hours of tapes answering questions passed to her through an intermediary, that the most intimate revelations in those pages came from her own mouth. She had taken authorship of her own story and handed it to the public through the back door, because every other door had been closed to her. The book did not merely report a troubled marriage, it permanently altered how the British monarchy was understood. The fairy tale was not just questioned, it was demolished in hardback on every bestseller list in the country. Consider how that book was actually made, because the method is a portrait of how trapped she had become. Diana never met Andrew Morton. She could not be seen to cooperate, and so the questions traveled to her through a mutual friend, a man named Dr. James Colhurst, who carried Morton's questions to Kensington Palace and carried Diana's taped answers back. On those tapes, she spoke plainly, in her own voice, about the bulimia, about throwing herself down the stairs, about the despair, about Camilla, about a marriage in which she had felt herself disappearing. It was the testimony of a woman who had concluded that the only way to be believed was to go around everyone who refused to believe her. When the book appeared in June 1992, serialized first in the Sunday Times, the reaction inside the establishment was fury and disbelief. The Press Complaints Commission condemned it. Senior courtiers privately raged. Friends of Diana publicly denied she had any part in it. And she allowed them to, because the deniability was the whole point. But the genie was out. For the first time, the public was reading the private reality in the words, though they did not yet know it, of the princess herself. And once a country has read that its fairy tale princess has been making herself sick and contemplating ending her life inside the most envied marriage on earth, it cannot unread it. The year got worse from there, and it got worse so comprehensively that the Queen herself, in a speech that November, would describe 1992 as an annus horribilis, a horrible year. There was the publication of the so-called Squidgygate tape, a recording of an intimate telephone conversation between Diana and a close male friend, James Gilby, that exposed her own private life to the same humiliating scrutiny. There was a windswept tour of South Korea in which the couple's misery was so visible in every photograph that the press christened them the Glums. There was, at Windsor in November, a catastrophic fire that gutted part of the castle, a literal image of the institution in flames. And then, on the 9th of December, 1992, the Prime Minister, John Major, rose in the House of Commons and read a statement to a hushed chamber. The Prince and Princess of Wales, he announced, had decided to separate. The decision, he said, had been reached amicably. There were no plans to divorce. Their constitutional positions were unaffected, and it remained possible, he told the House, that the princess could one day be crowned queen. Sit with the shape of that year for a moment, because it was not only the marriage that seemed to be coming apart, but the whole edifice around it. The Squidgygate recording had in fact been made years earlier, on New Year's Eve in 1989, and its surfacing in 1992, Sound Night, alongside the leaks flowing the other way about Charles, gave the public the queasy sense that the most private moments of these people's lives were being intercepted, traded, and printed. It was no longer a marriage with problems. It was a marriage being conducted in front of the entire country, with both parties' intimate telephone calls available for purchase at any newsstand. 3 of the Queen's 4 children would see their marriages fail in the space of that single year. Charles separated, Andrew separated from Sarah Ferguson and divorced. When the Queen rose at the Guildhall in November and called it a horrible year, her voice rough with a cold, it was the closest the public had come in 40 years to hearing the monarch admit that something at the heart of the family had gone badly wrong. And 4 days into December, that admission was made constitutional fact at the dispatch box of the House of Commons. Listen to the language of that statement because it tells you everything about the institution at the center of this story. Read the words again: amicable, no plans to divorce, constitutional positions unaffected. This was a marriage that had collapsed into mutual misery, infidelity on both sides, eating disorders, recorded phone calls, and a tell-all book, being described to Parliament in the flat administrative dialect of state continuity. The monarchy's first instinct, faced with the visible ruin of its most important marriage, was not to acknowledge pain. It was to reassure the country that the constitutional machinery would keep running. That does not prove the people involved were cruel. It proves where their priorities lay. The institution spoke in the language of continuity because continuity was the only language it truly trusted. Diana by now had begun to speak a different language entirely, the language of injury, of feeling, of personal truth, and those two languages had stopped being able to hear one another. The early consequences of the separation rearranged everyone, and they did so along the lines you would expect from the people involved. The household split into rival camps, each with its own staff, its own advisors, its own version of events, to brief to its own favored journalist. A conflict that the press soon named the War of the Waleses, fought not with lawyers but with leaks. Charles's circle began to think in terms of rehabilitation and explanation, of finding a way to make the public understand his side. Diana increasingly understood the uses of disclosure, the power of a sympathetic photograph or a well-placed confidence. The Queen's household sought, above all, stability, a way to keep the damage from spreading to the crown itself. This was the period in which the two courts hardened into something close to enemy states. Charles's side, organized around St. James's Palace and his private secretary's office, briefed friendly columnists about a long-suffering, intellectually serious prince undermined by an unstable wife. Diana's side answered with images and access that made her the wronged, radiant heroine of a cold establishment. Each leak demanded a counter-leak. A photograph of Diana alone and contemplative in front of the Taj Mahal in 1992. The monument to a great love, with the future king conspicuously absent, was understood by everyone who saw it as a message, and it was received around the world exactly as intended. She had learned that she did not need to say anything at all. She could simply arrange to be photographed, and the picture would say it for her. The institution, which had spent centuries controlling its own image, found itself outmaneuvered by a woman who understood the modern camera better than any palace advisor alive, and the Spencer family grew more openly protective of one of their own. And in the middle of all of it were 2 boys, 10 and 8 years old in that December, living now in the atmosphere of a marriage that had become a matter of state. Children who had heard the arguments behind doors, who would soon read about their parents in the newspapers, their classmates' families also read, and who were being slowly made into symbols at exactly the age when they most needed to be allowed to be children. The adults had made the arrangement, the children were beginning to absorb the cost. There is a detail from this period worth holding up to the light because it shows what the cost actually looked like at the level of a child's day. The boys were at school. William would soon go to Eton, a short walk across the river from Windsor Castle. And the newspapers their schoolmates read, The newspapers in every newsagent and on every breakfast table in the country were carrying the intimate failures of their parents' marriage as a running serial. There is no protocol for that. There is no equerry who can shield an 11-year-old from the playground. Diana, to her credit, tried to give her sons a window onto ordinary life that no royal children had been given before. Cues at theme parks, fast food, films, the experience of being, however briefly, just boys out with their mother. But she could not give them privacy because she had, in her own desperation, helped to make their family the most public story in Britain. That contradiction sits at the center of her motherhood and cannot be resolved. She loved them fiercely and protected them tenderly, and she was also a principal in a war that was being fought. In part, in the press, they would grow up reading. Both things were true. In this story, both things are almost always true at once. By the end of 1992, the marriage was, in every way that mattered, over, but the war over who would get to define what had broken it had only just begun. What the public felt, watching the separation announced in the flat language of a government statement, was something closer to grief than to scandal. A sense that a story they had been told to believe in for 11 years had been a kind of fiction all along, and that the people who had sold it to them had known. That feeling of having been deceived by the very institution that traded on their affection would prove dangerous to the monarchy in ways no one yet understood. Charles had spent years on the defensive, denied, contained, advised to say nothing. Now his circle was preparing to let him speak, to put his own version before the country at last. And Diana, who had already proved she could reach the public more powerfully than any palace statement, was preparing to answer. The cameras were not going away. If anything, they were drawing closer. He was about to explain himself to the nation. She was about to explain herself louder. The escalation came as a series of separate humiliations rather than one long blur, and the first of them arrived in January 1993, barely a month after the separation had been announced to Parliament. A newspaper published the transcript of an intercepted telephone conversation between Charles and Camilla, an intimate late-night call recorded years earlier, in which two people who were supposed to be no more than old friends spoke to one another with the unmistakable tenderness and longing of lovers. The press named it with the cruelty the moment invited after the most embarrassing line in it. The specific contents do not need to be repeated here. What mattered was not the words, but what the words proved. For years, the palace had insisted, through denials and friendly briefings, that the triangle Diana described was a fantasy, the imagining of an unstable woman. The tape ended that argument permanently. It confirmed in the participants' own voices that the emotional affair at the center of the marriage was real, that it had been real for a long time, and that it was ongoing. The future King of England had been recorded speaking to a married woman in terms that left nothing to interpret, and the whole country had now read it. What this did to the monarchy itself, beyond the individuals, was more serious than the palace was willing to admit aloud. For the first time in living memory, serious people began to ask serious questions about the institution's survival. Opinion polls through the mid-1990s recorded falling support for the crown and rising sympathy for the idea that Charles should be passed over in favor of his son, or that the monarchy might not be needed at all. Commentators who had never before entertained the thought began writing about a republic. The mystique on which the whole thing depended, the sense that this family was somehow finer, more dignified, more worthy of deference than ordinary people, had been the monarchy's only real asset, and it was bleeding away with every leaked tape and every front page. The institution had survived abdication and war and the loss of an empire by keeping its private life private. Now its private life was the most public thing in Britain, and the deference that had protected it for 1,000 years was draining out of the culture in real time. The men who ran the palace understood that they were no longer managing a marital embarrassment, they were managing a threat to the crown itself. The degradation of that episode worked in two directions, and both are worth tracking. For Charles, it was a catastrophe of dignity. The man who would one day be supreme governor of the Church of England, whose entire claim on the public rested on a certain gravity and seriousness, had been exposed in the most undignified way imaginable. His private intimacy turned into a national joke told in pubs and playgrounds. For Camilla, it was worse. She had spent 2 decades as a private figure, and now she was the most reviled woman in Britain, named in headlines, photographed through car windows, blamed by a public that had decided she was the serpent in the fairy tale. She was, in the public imagination, no longer a person at all, but a role. The other woman, the homewrecker, the villain, that she had her own marriage collapsing, her own children, her own private grief, was of no interest to anyone. And for Diana, the tape was a terrible vindication. Everything she had said, everything Morton's book had reported, everything she had been told was hysteria. All of it was now confirmed in Charles's own recorded voice. She had been right. But being right had cost her the marriage, and being right did not make her happy. It only made her certain. The country, meanwhile, had begun to divide itself along the fault line of the marriage, the way countries do when a famous union fails in public. There were people who pitied Charles, who saw a serious man trapped in an impossible role and married to a woman they regarded as manipulative and unstable. There were far more, and they grew more numerous with every leaked tape and every photograph, who saw Diana as the wronged innocent, the young bride betrayed by a cold husband and a colder institution. The marriage had become a kind of national Rorschach test, a story onto which people projected their own ideas about class, about loyalty, about men and women, about whether feeling or duty should govern a life. And in that contest, Diana held a decisive advantage because she was beautiful and warm and visibly suffering, and because the camera loved her, and because the institution ranged against her was old and cold and spoke in the dead language of constitutional position. She did not have to win the argument. She had already won the audience. What is rarely understood about this period is how the separation actually operated from day to day, because it was not a clean break, but a strange grinding cohabitation of two hostile courts inside a single institution. The Prince and Princess of Wales were separated but not divorced, which meant they were still, in the eyes of the Constitution, the future king and his queen, still expected to perform certain shared functions, still bound to appear together when the institution required a united front. And so there were occasions, the funerals, the great anniversaries, the moments of state when the family had to be seen as a family, when the two of them were obliged to ride in the same procession or stand on the same balcony, separated by inches, smiling for the cameras, having not spoken privately in months. Behind that performance ran two entirely separate operations. Charles had his household at St. James's, his private secretary, his press team, his circle of friends and advisors. Diana had hers at Kensington Palace, her own staff, her own allies, her own lines to sympathetic journalists. Each court briefed against the other. A story flattering to Diana would appear in one newspaper. A counter story, sympathetic to Charles, would appear the next day in another. Each side leaked, each side denied, each side blamed the other for leaking. The staff who worked for them lived inside a low war, choosing sides, carrying messages, watching their loyalty tested daily. The press had a name for the whole spectacle, the War of the Waleses, and it was an accurate one, because that is what it had become, a sustained campaign of attrition conducted through the media, in which the two most famous people in Britain fought for the sympathy of the public using every weapon available to them except honesty. The children moved through the center of this machinery like hostages who had learned to keep the peace. There were the school terms to be arranged, the holidays to be divided, the awful negotiations over who would have the boys for Christmas and who for the summer, all of it conducted between parents who communicated increasingly through lawyers and intermediaries. There were the birthdays attended separately, the sports days where both parents came but sat apart, the careful choreography required to keep two people who could barely tolerate one another both present in their sons' lives. And there was the relentless, inescapable fact that the boys could read. Whatever was kept from them at home, they could find on any newsstand, in any common room at school, on any television. Their parents' marriage dissected, their mother's bulimia described, their father's adultery confessed, the most private wounds of their family turned into the daily entertainment of a nation. No previous generation of royal children had grown up like this, under a press that felt entitled to everything, and a public that consumed it without shame. The institution that was supposed to protect them had instead made them the central characters in a story they had never agreed to tell. It was, in the end, the same inheritance the family passed down in every generation, only magnified now by satellite and tabloid into something no earlier Spencer or Windsor child had ever had to endure. The discovery, far too young, that you belong to the public before you belong to yourself. In the wake of all this, Diana did something that surprised everyone, including the press that had hounded her. In December 1993, at a charity lunch, she announced that she would be withdrawing from public life, reducing her engagements drastically, asking for the time and space to rebuild herself in private. She spoke with a directness no royal had used before, about the intrusion she had lived under, about the impossibility of the role, about needing to find a different kind of life. For a moment, it seemed she might genuinely retreat. But Diana could no more disappear than the tide could. She was the most famous woman alive, and the absence of new official engagements simply meant the cameras hunted her elsewhere. At the gym, on holiday, leaving restaurants, dropping her sons at school. And in that period of supposed withdrawal, something was shifting in her. She was beginning to understand that she did not need the institution at all to do the thing she was best at. She could take her star power and point it wherever she chose, at landmines, at AIDS hospices, at the sick and the dispossessed, and the world would follow her there. She was becoming in real time something the monarchy had no category for, a freelance humanitarian celebrity with more global reach than the crown itself, and no one above her to give the orders. What she did with that reach was not random, and it is one of the genuinely admirable threads in the whole story. She gravitated again and again toward the people the world found easiest to ignore. She visited hospices and held the hands of the dying. She worked with the homeless through the charity center point, taking the teenage William with her into shelters so that the future king would see how the other half of his country lived. She championed leprosy patients, touching people whom centuries of superstition had made untouchable, exactly as she had with AIDS sufferers years before. She seemed to understand, at a level deeper than strategy, that suffering recognizes suffering, that the very wounds that made her private life unbearable were what allowed her to reach the wounded so completely. The damaged princess and the great consoler were the same woman. She gave to strangers the tenderness she could not find at home, and they returned it a thousandfold. There was no script for what she did, no protocol, no advanced team smoothing the way. She simply sat on the edge of a bed and held a dying man's hand for as long as he needed it. And the photograph of that gesture did more to change public attitudes than a decade of official pronouncements. She had discovered the one currency the palace could not control, and she spent it freely. But the private cost of all this was steep, and the woman behind the radiance had become genuinely fragile. She leaned on a shifting circle of therapists, healers, astrologers, and confidants, searching for the steadiness no one in her marriage had given her. She made long, late night telephone calls to friends. She tried colonic treatments and acupuncture and the council of psychics. The way a person in real distress will try anything that promises relief. She could be warm and funny and devastatingly perceptive, and she could be jealous, mistrustful, and consumed by the sense that she was being watched and plotted against, in fears that they were not entirely paranoid, because in her case, some of them were true. She was a woman in her early 30s who had been famous since she was 19, who had never been allowed to develop an ordinary adult life, and who was now navigating the most scrutinized existence on earth essentially alone. The freedom she had won from the institution was real. So was the loneliness inside it. Then came the second fracture, and it was self-inflicted, and it came from the other side. By 1994, Charles's circle had decided that the way to rehabilitate him was to let him tell his own story properly, seriously, on his own terms. The vehicle was the broadcaster and writer Jonathan Dimbleby, who was given extraordinary access for an authorized biography and an accompanying television documentary marking the 25th anniversary of Charles's investiture as Prince of Wales. The film, broadcast on the 29th of June 1994, was meant to show the public the real Charles, the thoughtful, dutiful, hard-working heir, the man behind the caricature. And for much of its length it did. But the documentary will be remembered for one exchange. Asked directly whether he had been faithful in his marriage, Charles answered that he had been until the marriage had become, in his word, irretrievably broken down. It was a careful, lawyerly admission, hedged with a timeline meant to protect him. It did not protect him. What the country heard was simple and brutal. The heir to the throne had gone on television and confessed to adultery. The accompanying book, when it appeared, made things worse rather than better, and it did so in a way that reaches back into the deepest theme of this whole story. In the Dimbleby biography, Charles's account of his own marriage was bleak and self-pitying. He portrayed himself as a man who had been pressured into a union he had doubts about, who had never been allowed the freedom to marry for love, who had done his duty and been miserable for it. He suggested, in passages that wounded his family deeply, that his father, Prince Philip, had effectively forced his hand in 1981, writing to him in terms that left him feeling he had no choice but to propose to Diana or dishonor her. Whether Philip's letters were truly the ultimatum Charles remembered, or the firm advice of a father to a dithering son, became its own bitter dispute. But the revelation laid bare the generational machinery at the heart of everything. A man raised to subordinate his own heart to the family's needs, now blaming the previous generation for the unhappiness he had passed down to the next. The pattern did not begin with Charles, and it would not end with him. Each generation in this family inherited the same lesson: that duty comes before desire, that feeling is a luxury the institution cannot afford. And each generation paid for it in its own marriage. There was a further dimension to the adultery admission that the secular press sometimes underplayed, but the establishment understood at once. Charles was not merely a husband. He was the heir to a throne whose holder is, by the Constitution, the supreme governor of the Church of England, the head of a church founded, with grim historical irony, when a king broke with Rome in order to set aside one wife for another. For the future occupant of that role to confess publicly to adultery raised questions that were not only personal but constitutional and religious, questions about whether he could ever be crowned, whether he could ever marry the woman at the center of the scandal, whether the whole arrangement could be reconciled with the institutions Charles was destined to embody. Those questions would hang over him for a decade. 1994 was the year he made his own succession a subject of open national doubt. The miscalculation was total. Charles and his advisors had imagined a film that would let a complex man reclaim his story. What they detonated instead was a fresh moral crisis. The admission dominated every front page. It confirmed from his own mouth and on his own commission program exactly the betrayal the institution had spent years trying to deny. And it handed Diana the moral high ground in the most public way possible. Because whatever she had done, whatever relationship she had sought in her loneliness, she had not gone on national television and admitted to breaking the marriage. The contrast was devastating, and it was made unforgettable that very night by a single image, because Diana understood theater in a way Charles never would. On the evening the Dimbleby film was broadcast, she stepped out of a car at a gala at the Serpentine Gallery in a short, off-the-shoulder black cocktail dress, radiant and defiant and entirely in command of every lens pointed at her. The press christened it the revenge dress. While Charles's confession played on television, Diana owned every front page beside it, not as a victim, but as a woman who had decided she would no longer be defined by his story. It was one of the most effective wordless replies in the history of public life. She had not said a thing. She had simply arrived and won the day. From this point, the characters' trajectories diverged so sharply that they can almost be drawn as separate lines pulling away from a single point. Charles's path bent towards slow, patient rehabilitation. He was still damaged, still bound to Camilla, still constitutionally indispensable. He would be king one day, no matter what the public thought of him. And so his circle settled in for the long work of rebuilding his reputation across years, knowing that time and duty and the eventual softening of public memory were on his side. Camilla's path, for now, ran through the wilderness. She was kept out of sight, reviled, waiting, though a quiet, decades-long campaign to make her acceptable to the British public was already very faintly beginning. There was a peculiar doubleness to Charles's life in these years worth holding on to, because it captures something essential about the institution he served. While his marriage was being dismantled on every front page, the official machinery of his existence simply continued, as it was designed to. He opened buildings, he planted trees, he gave speeches on architecture and the environment and the plight of the inner cities, the causes that genuinely engaged him and on which, away from the noise, he was often thoughtful and ahead of his time. He ran the Prince's Trust, which had quietly transformed the lives of thousands of young people and which remains, by any fair measure, a substantial achievement. He carried out the hundreds of small, dutiful, largely invisible engagements that make up the working life of an heir to the throne. None of it made the front pages because none of it was as profitable as his pain. And so the public came to know a Charles who was almost entirely a creature of his marriage's collapse, cold, remote, adulterous, faintly absurd. While the other Charles, the diligent and serious public servant, went about his work in the spaces the scandal left empty. This was the institution functioning exactly as intended. The role continued no matter what happened to the man inside it. Whatever private wreckage he was living through, the heir was still the heir, and the duties did not stop. It was the same lesson the family taught in every generation, the lesson that had shaped him from boyhood and would shape his sons after him, that the person is expendable, but the crown endures, and the show, whatever the cost, goes on. It is worth pausing on what those years cost Camilla, because she is the figure this story most often flattens into caricature. Her own marriage to Andrew Parker Bowles formally ended in 1995, the two of them having lived largely separate lives for years. She retreated to her house in Wiltshire and lived as privately as a woman of her notoriety could, enduring the abuse, the booing in supermarket car parks, the bread rolls reportedly thrown at her, the universal verdict that she was the woman who had ruined a fairy tale. She did not give interviews. She did not defend herself. She absorbed the public loathing in near total silence, which was, in its way, the most aristocratic response available to her. The old code that one simply did not explain oneself in public, no matter the provocation. And slowly, with the patience that the institution specializes in, the work of rehabilitating her began. Carefully managed glimpses, a gradual normalizing of her presence in Charles's life, the long game of waiting for public feeling to soften and for a new generation to arrive that did not remember the worst of it. No one in 1994 would have believed that this woman would one day be queen. The fact that she eventually was is one of the most remarkable acts of reputational survival in modern British life, and it was already quietly underway. Diana's path was the most dramatic and the most dangerous because it had no map. She was no longer the obedient fairy tale princess, and she was not yet anything the world had a name for. She was a woman of immense fame and immense influence, operating entirely outside the institution that had created her, beloved by the public, distrusted by the palace, pursued relentlessly by photographers who had learned that her image was the single most valuable commodity in journalism. She was free. She was also, in a way she did not fully grasp, more exposed than she had ever been inside the marriage, because the institution that had once at least nominally protected her was now increasingly something she stood against. And then there were the boys, who by the mid 1990s were no longer small children but adolescents, William at Eton, Harry close behind, old enough now to read everything, to understand everything, to feel the full weight of being the sons in the most public marriage breakdown in the world. They were living, in the most literal sense, the oldest pattern in this whole story. The adults had made the choices, and the children were paying for them. They moved between two parents who could barely speak to one another, two households at war, a father absorbed in rehabilitating his reputation, and a mother increasingly living her emotional life in public. By several accounts, William in particular became protective of his mother, attuned to her moods, aware in a way no teenage boy should have to be of how fragile she could be. He was learning far too young to manage a parent rather than to be parented. Whatever else the adults around these children believed they were defending, the crown, their reputations, their versions of the truth, the cost was being quietly transferred, as it always is, to the next generation. The two brothers were already beginning to respond to that inheritance in the different ways that would define the rest of their lives. William, the elder, the heir, turned inward and protective, careful, contained, watchful, a boy who learned to read a room and absorb tension and hold himself responsible for his mother's happiness in a way that no child should have to. He would grow into a man who craved stability and privacy above almost everything, who would build his adult life as a deliberate refutation of the chaos he had been raised in. Harry, the younger, the spare, had less of the burden of destiny and more of the burden of being surplus. The second son in a system that has only one job for a second son, which is to exist as insurance. He would grow into a man of warmth and recklessness and barely contain anger, more like his mother in his hunger for love and his fury at the institution, and his life would become, eventually, an open rebellion against everything William chose to endure. But all of that was years away. In the mid-1990s, they were simply two boys at school, reading about their parents in the papers, learning the lesson this family teaches every generation, that you do not get to be a child for very long, and that the price of the name is always extracted from the young. The world that surrounded all of this had grown crowded and predatory in a way that is essential to understanding what came next. The tabloid press of mid-1990s Britain had discovered that the Wales marriage was the most profitable story in the history of the industry, and an entire economy had grown up around photographing Diana. Freelance photographers, the paparazzi, pursued her on motorbikes, lay in wait outside every door, sold single images for sums that would once have funded a year of ordinary work. The editors who bought those images understood exactly what they were trading in, and the public that bought the newspapers was complicit too, because the demand was bottomless. Diana both loathed this machine and at moments used it, summoning it when she had a message to send and fleeing it when she did not. A relationship of mutual exploitation that no one could control and that was accelerating towards something. There was a physical reality to this pursuit that must be established now because it would matter terribly later. A single clear photograph of Diana, alone with a new companion, crying, laughing, anything, could be worth a fortune. And so the men who chased her hard. They blocked her car. They ran red lights to keep pace with her. They surrounded her on foot until she could not move, and waited outside restaurants in packs, and tailed her holidays by speedboat and motorbike and on foot through the streets of every city she visited. She lived by the mid 1990s inside a permanent low grade emergency of being hunted, and she said so repeatedly to anyone who would listen. That she felt like a hunted animal, that she feared the pursuit would one day go too far. People treated this as the complaint of a privileged woman about the price of fame. It was, in fact, an accurate description of a danger that was building toward a specific outcome on a specific night that none of them could yet see. Into this crowded, dangerous world, in the autumn of 1995, a young and ambitious BBC journalist named Martin Bashir was quietly working his way toward the Princess of Wales, approaching the perimeter of her trust, through people close to her, preparing the ground for an interview that would become the most famous of her life, and decades later, one of the great scandals of British broadcasting. Charles had taken his turn. He had gone on television to define the story, and he had only deepened the sense of collapse. Now it was Diana's turn, and what she was about to do would make his confession look like a warm-up. She was not going to send a message through a photograph this time, or leak a story through a friend, or let a book speak for her. While she maintained deniability, she was going to sit down in front of a camera in her own home and tell the entire country in her own words everything: the marriage, the betrayal, the illness, the institution that had failed her. She had spent 14 years being narrated by other people. She was about to seize the microphone for good. What she did changed everything, and it could not be undone. For roughly an hour, watched by tens of millions of people in Britain and many more around the world, the Princess of Wales spoke about her marriage with a frankness no member of the royal family had ever shown in public. She talked about the bulimia that had racked her, naming it plainly as a symptom of a marriage in which she felt unloved and unwanted rather than as some private failing of her own. She talked about the despair that had driven her to harm herself, and about the way the institution around her had treated her distress as the problem to be managed rather than the wound to be healed. She talked, in the line that would outlive everything else she said, about the marriage having been crowded, that there had been 3 people in it, and that this had made things rather difficult. And she questioned, quietly but unmistakably, whether the man she had married was suited to the throne at all, suggesting that the top job, as she called it, might bring limitations he could not accept. It was an extraordinary thing for the mother of the future king to say about his father on national television. She had stopped being a wife defending a marriage and become a witness testifying against an institution. The effect was seismic, and it ran in every direction at once. For the public, it was the final confirmation of everything they had come to suspect, delivered not through a leaked tape or a friend's account, but by Diana herself, looking directly into the camera, composed and devastating. For the institution, it was a catastrophe beyond anything Morton's book or the Camilla tape had produced, because it could not be dismissed as gossip or distortion. It was the Princess of Wales, in her own words, indicting the family she had married into. And for the Queen, who had watched in silence as her son's marriage disintegrated through years of leaks and confessions and rival briefings, it was the end of patience. Within weeks of the broadcast, she wrote to both Charles and Diana in terms that were unmistakably an instruction rather than a suggestion, telling them that an early divorce was now in the best interest of the country, the family, and above all, the children. The sovereign had spoken. The separation that the palace had spent years framing as a private and reversible arrangement was about to become a final legal end. There is an epilogue to that interview that did not emerge for a quarter of a century, and it changes how the triumph should be understood. The journalist who secured the interview, a then little-known BBC reporter, had not won Diana's trust by honest means. To gain access to her, he had approached her brother, Earl Spencer, and shown him forged bank statements, fabricated documents purporting to prove that members of Diana's own circle were being paid by the security services to spy on her. The forgeries fed and inflamed the very fears of surveillance and betrayal that already haunted her, and they helped persuade her that she could trust no one inside the system, and that speaking out was her only protection. In 2021, a formal inquiry led by a senior judge, Lord Dyson, examined how the interview had been obtained and concluded that the journalist had acted deceitfully and in serious breach of the broadcaster's own guidelines, and that the BBC had then covered up what it knew. The inquiry was careful to add that Diana had been keen to tell her story regardless, and most likely would have given an interview to someone reputable in any case. But the damage to her was real. The most famous act of truth-telling in her life had been procured through a lie that preyed on her deepest anxieties. Her sons, when the report was published, spoke of it with open anger, one of them saying that the deceit had contributed to the fear and paranoia of her final years, and that the interview should never be shown again. The exploitation of Diana did not end with her death. It had begun while she lived, and it reached even into the moment the public remember as her bravest. The microphone she had seized to tell her truth had been handed to her by a man telling lies. Once she had spoken like that, the divorce was no longer a question of whether, but of how and when. The negotiations that followed were protracted and bitter, conducted through lawyers over the better part of a year, and they turned in large part on two questions: money and titles. Diana fought to keep the style of Her Royal Highness, not out of vanity, but because she understood what its loss would mean. That she would be formally cast out of the inner circle of the family, ranked below her own sons in the order of precedence, stripped of the rank that had been the one solid thing the marriage had given her. She lost that fight. When the divorce was made final on the 28th of August, 1996, she received a substantial financial settlement and the right to go on living at Kensington Palace and to share fully in the raising of William and Harry, but she ceased to be Her Royal Highness. She would be known now as Diana, Princess of Wales. Still a princess by the courtesy of her former husband's rank, but no longer royal in the way that mattered to the institution. The loss of those two letters of style was, in the end, the institution's last word on her. A precise, bureaucratic act of distancing, a way of saying that whatever she had been to the public, to the family, she was now an outsider to be ranked and placed. She had married a prince at 19 in front of 750 million people. 15 years later, at 35, she walked out of the marriage with a title that sounded grand and meant, in the cold internal arithmetic of the palace, that she was no longer one of them. The arrangement that governed the rest of her life was, by the standards of most divorces, generous, and yet it left her in a peculiar limbo that suited no one. She kept her apartments at Kensington Palace, the home she had occupied throughout the marriage, but the palace was now a strange place for her to be. Still inside the royal estate, still surrounded by the staff and rhythms of the institution, yet no longer of it. She shared the boys with Charles on terms that were, for once, worked out with genuine care for the children rather than as weapons in a war, and by every account the months after the divorce brought a kind of fragile calm to the family that had been absent for years. The bitterness that had defined the separation began slowly to settle. Diana was no longer fighting for her place. She had lost it, and in losing it she had been released from the exhausting performance of defending it. Friends from this period describe a woman who seemed in flashes lighter than she had been in a decade, funnier, freer, more herself. She had escaped the thing that had nearly destroyed her. What she had not escaped, and could not, was the fame, which had, if anything, intensified now that she was a free woman whose private life was once again a matter of open speculation. The strange thing about the year that followed, the last year of her life, though no one knew it, is that losing the royal title did not diminish her in the eyes of the world at all. If anything, it freed her. No longer bound by the constraints of the institution, no longer required to clear her causes with palace advisors, she threw herself into the humanitarian work that had become the truest expression of who she was. In January of 1997, she walked through a partially cleared minefield in Angola, wearing a protective visor and body armor, drawing the eyes of the world to the tens of thousands of people maimed every year by landmines left in the ground long after the wars that planted them had ended. The images traveled everywhere. Some politicians grumbled that she had strayed into matters that did not concern her, that a princess should not meddle in questions of policy. She ignored them. Later that year, she walked through another minefield in Bosnia, and the campaign she had lent her face to gather the momentum that would help carry an international treaty banning the weapons to signature within months of her death. She had found at last a way to use the only thing the institution had never been able to take from her, the world's attention, for something that mattered. She was 36 years old, more famous than she had ever been, and for the first time in a very long time, beginning to look as though she might be building a life of her own. The landmine work mattered to her in a way that went beyond charity, and it is worth understanding why, because it shows what she had become by the end. She had grasped something about her own power that the politicians who criticized her had not. That a photograph of the most famous woman in the world walking through a live minefield or sitting beside a child whose legs had been blown away could do in a single afternoon what years of careful diplomacy could not. She was not interested in the technicalities of arms control treaties. She was interested in making the world look at the people the treaties were about, and the world looked because it could not help looking at her. In the months after Angola, she lent her name and her presence to the cause again and again, and the international campaign to ban the weapons gathered a force that culminated a few months after her death in a treaty signed by most of the nations on earth. She did not live to see it, but the timing was such that many believed, with some justice, that her death had shamed the holdouts into signing, that she had served the cause more powerfully in dying than she could have known in life. It was a grim thought and a measure of what she had become. A woman whose every act, even her death, moved the world. That summer, she spent time aboard a yacht in the Mediterranean as the guest of Mohammed Al Fayed, the Egyptian businessman who owned the Harrods department store and the Ritz Hotel in Paris. It was there that she began a relationship with his son, Dodi Fayed, a film producer in his early 40s. The romance, whatever it might have become, was conducted under the most intense press scrutiny of Diana's life, because by now a single photograph of her with a new man was worth a sum that beggared belief, and the photographers who pursued her had every financial incentive to take any risk to get it. Through August, the couple were tracked across the Mediterranean, the long lenses trained on the yacht, the images of them together selling around the world. There is no need to overstate the seriousness of the relationship. What matters for the story is the pursuit it provoked, the way it raised the commercial value of Diana's image to a frenzy in the final weeks of her life, and the way it drew her, at the end of that August, to Paris. The gathering storm of those last days is best understood not through melodrama, but through the accumulation of ordinary, almost mundane detail, because that is what makes it unbearable in hindsight. There were the boys, William and Harry, back in Britain and Balmoral with their father and the rest of the royal family, doing the ordinary things of a summer holiday, expecting to see their mother again in a few days. There were the hotel movements in Paris, the cars arranged and rearranged, the photographers gathering outside the Ritz in numbers that grew through the evening of the 30th of August. There was the decision, late that night, to leave the hotel by a rear entrance, to use a decoy at the front, to put Diana and Dodi into a car, driven by a man named Henry Paul, the deputy head of security at the Ritz, in an attempt to escape the pack of photographers waiting to chase them. There was the speed and the dark and the tunnel. There was the road beneath the Pont de l'Alma, a riverside underpass with a row of unforgiving concrete pillars dividing its lanes, approached too fast by a driver who should never have been behind the wheel. And there were the motorbikes behind, carrying the men whose photographs of her had become the most valuable in the world, in pursuit to the very end. It is worth slowing down over the texture of that last evening, because almost everything about it was ordinary, and that is precisely what makes it so hard to bear. Diana and Dodi had spent the day quietly. They had intended to dine at a restaurant and had changed their plans because of the crush of photographers, retreating instead to dine privately at the Ritz, which the Fayed family owned. The evening was, by the standards of her life, unremarkable. A couple having dinner in a hotel, trying to find an hour of peace. The trouble was only ever the leaving. Outside the hotel, the photographers had gathered in numbers, dozens of them, knowing that a single frame of the couple together was worth a small fortune, and the decision to slip out the back in a single car was an improvised attempt to outrun them. Henri Paul, who had finished his shift and been called back, assured the photographers at the front that they would have noshak, then went to the rear to drive the couple himself. None of the people making these small choices and which door, which car, which driver, how fast, could have known that they were assembling piece by ordinary piece the conditions of a catastrophe. That is the nature of such things. No one decides to die in a tunnel. They decide to avoid the photographers and to take the back way and to go quickly, and the rest follows from physics and chance. What happened in the early hours of the 31st of August, 1997, is best told plainly and without embellishment, out of respect for the people who died in it. The car, traveling at high speed, lost control as it entered the underpass and struck the 13th pillar almost head-on, the impact was catastrophic. Of the four people in the car, two, Dodi Fayed and the driver, Henry Paul, were killed outright. Diana and the fourth occupant, a bodyguard named Trevor Rees-Jones, survived the initial impact. Rees-Jones, the only one of the four wearing a seatbelt, would be gravely injured but would live. Diana, who was not, was alive when the emergency services reached her, but desperately hurt. She was cut from the wreckage and taken to hospital, where surgeons fought for hours to save her. She did not survive. In the early hours of the morning, in a hospital in a foreign city, a long British police investigation and the formal inquest that concluded in 2008 returned a verdict of unlawful killing through the gross negligence of the driver and of the pursuing photographers. Henry Paul, it was established, had been driving far too fast and had drink and prescription drugs in his system well above the legal limits. He should not have been at the wheel at all. The photographers who chased the car into the tunnel had contributed to the conditions that made the crash possible, and the failure of the passengers in the back to wear seatbelts had turned a survivable crash into a fatal one. A separate, exhaustive investigation, mounted specifically to examine the conspiracy theories that swirled around the death, was that the security services had murdered her, that the establishment had arranged it to be rid of her, found no evidence whatsoever of any plot. There was no shadowy hand. There was a drunk driver, a reckless speed, an unforgiving pillar, and a pack of men chasing a woman through a tunnel to photograph her. The most ordinary causes imaginable had produced the least ordinary loss of the age, and yet the very ordinariness of those causes would prove, for many, impossible to accept because it seemed monstrously inadequate to the scale of who had been lost. That a woman so luminous, so globally beloved, so seemingly protected by her fame, could be extinguished by something as banal as a speeding car in a tunnel, struck a great many people as wrong in some deep way that no inquiry could ever soothe. The conspiracy theories that took root in that gap between the size of the loss and the smallness of its cause would prove astonishingly durable, and they return later in this story. For now, it is enough to record what the evidence established, which was an accident, like preventable, foreseeable, the direct product of the way she had been hunted, but an accident all the same, with no villain grand enough to match the size of the grief. The news traveled across the world faster than the mind could absorb it. In Britain, it broke in the dead of night, and people woke on the morning of the 31st of August to a thing that did not seem possible. That Diana, the most vivid and alive of all of them, was gone. The newsreaders who delivered it struggled to keep their composure. In capitals across the world, programming was interrupted, front pages were torn up and reset, and a planet that had watched her wedding and followed her marriage and consumed her image for 16 years stopped, for a moment, in something like collective shock. She had been, by the end, perhaps the most famous woman who had ever lived, recognizable in every country on earth, and the sheer scale of her fame meant that her death was not a British event, but a global one. In Sydney and New York and Cairo and Tokyo, People who had never met her and never would wept for her as though they had lost someone they knew, because in the peculiar intimacy of modern fame, they felt they had. That was the thing the institution had never understood about her and would struggle to understand even now. That she had reached people in a way no royal personage ever had. That the connection was real, even though it was mediated entirely through images, and that the grief now breaking over the world was therefore real too, and would not be satisfied by the cold formulas of constitutional mourning. At Balmoral, the decision was taken to wake the family, but to let the two boys sleep, to give them a few more hours of not knowing before their world was broken. It fell to their father to tell them. Charles woke William and Harry that morning and told them that their mother had died in the night. William was 15, Harry was 12. Whatever can be said about the marriage and its failures, this was the moment toward which all of it had been traveling, and it landed where it always lands in this family, on the children. The two boys who had grown up watching their parents' marriage dissected in public now learned, in a single sentence on a grey Scottish morning, that the public would never give their mother back. There has been much argument since over how the family handled those first days at Balmoral, and both sides of it deserve a fair hearing, because the truth is more complicated than the version that hardened into legend. The decision to keep the boys in Scotland away from London and the cameras, to let them grieve in private, to take them to church that first morning, and to surround them with the ordinary structure of family rather than the spectacle of national mourning, was made by a grandmother and a father who believed, with the whole weight of their upbringing behind them, the children are protected by routine and shielded from display. It was the institution's deepest instinct that grief is private, that one does not perform one's feelings, that dignity lies in restraint. By the standards of the family that held it, it was an act of care. The trouble was that the country outside Balmoral did not share those standards and could not see the care and saw only silence. A royal family that appeared to feel nothing for the woman the nation was weeping over. Two codes of grief, the private and the public, the aristocratic and the popular, collided over the bodies of two boys, and for a few extraordinary days it was genuinely unclear which one would prevail. Charles did the thing that fell to him to do, and in doing it he became, for a few days, something other than the man the public had spent years reviling. He insisted, against some resistance within the family, on flying to Paris himself to bring Diana home. He traveled with her two sisters, Lady Sarah and Lady Jane, the Spencer women coming to collect their own. At the hospital, he stood with them in the room where she lay, and then he accompanied her body back to Britain, the former husband become the man sent to bring the Princess of Wales home, her coffin carried from the aircraft draped in the royal standard and taken first to a private mortuary and then to the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace, where she would lie until the funeral. It was a strange and terrible symmetry. The institution that had absorbed her at 19 and cast her out at 35 now reached out in death to gather her back. She had spent her life trying to escape the family, and in the end, it was the family that carried her home. There was something in that act that complicates any simple reading of Charles as the villain of the story, and it stands without resolving, because the truth of these people was always more tangled than the fairy tale or its inversion allowed. The man who had betrayed her, who had never loved her as she needed to be loved, who had caused her years of unhappiness, was also the man who insisted on going to bring her body home, who stood in the hospital room with her sisters, who would in the days to come walk behind her coffin beside their grieving sons. Whatever he had failed to give her in life, he did not fail her in this. People are not the cartoons that public stories make of them. Charles had been, by turns, weak and dutiful, cold and capable of feeling, a poor husband and a man trying, in the only ways his upbringing had left him, to do right by the mother of his children at the end. None of it undid the damage, but none of the damage undid this either. The story had room for both, even if the public, in its grief and its fury, did not. But the country that woke to the news on that Sunday morning was not in any mood to be comforted by the institution, and this is where the final act of the story truly begins. Something was happening in the streets of London that the palace had not anticipated and did not understand. A wave of public grief so vast and so raw that it had no precedent in modern British life. By the thousands and then the hundreds of thousands, people came to the royal palaces and laid flowers, until the gates of Kensington Palace disappeared behind a tide of bouquets that grew deeper every hour. They wept openly in the streets. They queued for hours to sign books of condolence. The flowers piled up until they were waist deep against the railings. the cellophane crackling, the handwritten cards damp with rain and tears, a sea of grief so physical that the scent of it hung over the parks. People who had never cried in public cried now, strangers comforting strangers, the famous British Reserve dissolving into something raw and unfamiliar. And as the days passed, the grief began to curdle into something the monarchy had never faced before: anger. The people wanted their feelings acknowledged by the family Diana had married into, and the family 400 miles away at Balmoral, silent, observing its ancient codes of private mourning, seemed to be giving them nothing. The monarchy had spent 1,000 years mastering the choreography of public emotion, the processions, the ceremonies, the careful management of how the nation felt about itself. Now it faced a national grief it could neither command nor contain, for a woman it had failed to protect. And for the first time in living memory, the institution did not know what the public wanted from it or how to give it. For a week, between the death and the funeral, Britain became a country its own people did not entirely recognize. The famous reserve, the stiff upper lip that had been sold for generations as the essence of the national character, simply dissolved. Grown men wept on the pavements, strangers embraced, the roads around the royal parks filled with so many flowers that they had to be measured in tons, and the queues to sign the books of condolence stretched for hours and then for miles. Something had been released in the public that had no obvious precedent and made the commentators reach, uneasily, for comparisons to other nations and other ages. And running underneath the grief, growing louder by the day, was a question aimed squarely at the family Diana had married into. Where were they? And why would they not come? And why would they not show that they felt what the whole country was feeling? The monarchy had spent 1,000 years teaching the British to keep their feelings to themselves, and now the British had a great public feeling they would not be talked out of, and the institution that had trained them in restraint found itself, suddenly and dangerously, on the wrong side of the national mood. The standoff that defined that week was in the end a quarrel about a flag. Above Buckingham Palace there flies, by ancient custom, only the royal standard, and only when the sovereign is in residence, and it is never flown at half-mast because the monarchy does not die. When one sovereign goes, another immediately reigns, and so the flag does not mourn. The Queen was at Balmoral, and so no flag flew over Buckingham Palace at all, and to a grieving public gathering in their thousands in the Mall. That bare flagpole became an unbearable symbol of a family that would not grieve with them. The newspapers, which days earlier had been Diana's tormentors, now turned on the monarchy with a fury that sensed the public mood and amplified it. They demanded that the Queen come to London, that she be seen, that she show the nation some sign that she shared its sorrow. They demanded a flag at half-mast over the palace. For several days, the institution and the public were locked in a confrontation that had no precedent and no rule book, the oldest monarchy in Europe discovering that the deference it had relied upon for 1,000 years had conditions attached to it that no one had ever spelled out, and that it was now failing to meet them. In the end, the institution bent because it had no other choice, and the bending was itself a kind of historic concession. The Queen returned to London. She walked among the flowers and the crowds outside the palaces, and was seen to read the cards, and the hostility softened in her presence as it always had. And on the eve of the funeral, she did something she had almost never done. She spoke to the nation directly, in a live broadcast, as a grandmother as much as a sovereign, paying tribute to Dinah and acknowledging the lessons to be drawn from her life and from the extraordinary public response to her death. And the royal standard came down, and in its place, for the first time in history, the Union flag was raised over Buckingham Palace and lowered to half-mast. It was a small thing and an enormous thing at once. The monarchy had been forced, by the sheer pressure of public feeling, to break its own oldest rules in order to survive a moment it had not created and could not control. Diana, who in life had so often bent the institution to her will simply by understanding the public better than it did, had done so one last time from beyond it. The funeral itself, on the 6th of September 1997, was watched by a global television audience that rivaled the wedding 16 years before, the two ceremonies bracketing her adult life like the covers of a book. Her coffin was borne on a gun carriage through streets lined with more than 1 million people, many of whom had slept on the pavements overnight to secure a place. The silence of that vast crowd broken only by the sound of weeping and the hooves of the horses. On the coffin lay white flowers and a handwritten card bearing a single word, written by her younger son, Mummy. And at a certain point in the procession, The cortege was joined by 5 men who walked behind the coffin on foot through the streets of London: her former husband Charles, her former father-in-law Prince Philip, her brother Charles Spencer, and her 2 sons, William 15 and Harry 12, walking with their eyes down and their faces rigid with the effort of composure, doing in front of the entire watching world the hardest thing that has ever been asked of 2 grieving children. It remains one of the most wrenching images of the age, and it should be allowed to land with its full weight. 2 boys made to walk behind their mother's body through a wall of public grief, performing the dignity the institution demanded even now, even of children, even on the worst morning of their lives. There had been an agonized discussion within the family about whether the boys should walk at all, and it was settled, by some accounts, only when their grandfather Prince Philip offered to walk beside them so that they would not have to do it alone. An old man's gesture of solidarity that is among the few genuinely tender things the institution managed in that whole terrible week, and so they walked, the 5 of them, behind the slow gun carriage, past the banks of flowers and the silent crowds and the long lenses that even now, even here, were trained upon the grieving sons. Whatever the boys felt in those 40 minutes, they kept entirely within themselves, as they had been raised to do, as the watching millions willed them to be spared and could not look away from all the same. Years later, both men would speak of the strangeness of it, of being asked to master a private agony in front of the largest audience that had ever watched a human being grieve. The service at Westminster Abbey held one more rupture, and it came from the Spencer side. Diana's brother, Charles Spencer, rose to deliver the eulogy, and what he delivered was not the careful, consoling tribute the occasion conventionally called for, but something closer to an indictment. He spoke of his sister with love and grief, but he also spoke in barely coded terms against the institution he believed had made her suffer, and against the press he held responsible for hunting her to death. And he made a promise that her blood family would ensure that her sons' souls were not simply immersed in duty and tradition, but were allowed to sing openly as she had wanted. It was an extraordinary thing to say in that place, with the royal family seated feet away, and when he finished, something unprecedented happened. The crowds outside, listening on loudspeakers, began to applaud, and the applause rolled in through the great doors of the abbey and down its length until those inside joined it too. The clapping of a congregation at a royal funeral, in defiance of every convention of such occasions, was the public rendering its verdict one last time. They had heard a brother accuse the establishment of failing his sister, and they had agreed. And then the public part was over, and the family took her back to the place she had come from. Diana was buried privately, away from all cameras, at Althorpe, the Spencer estate where she had spent her childhood, on a small wooded island in the middle of an ornamental lake, where no one could reach her and the photographers could never come. It was the final symmetry of a life lived entirely in public, that she should rest, at the last, on an island, behind water, in the grounds of the great lonely house she had been born beside, and had spent her whole life trying to escape. She had begun at Sandringham, in the gift of the royal family, and ended at Althorpe, reclaimed by her own. The girl the institution had taken at 19 was given back to the Spencers at 36, and the gravel of the long Spencer Drive, which she had known as a child, led now to her grave. There is a detail in this that returns the whole story to where it began. Diana had a memory from her childhood, often recounted, of the sound of her mother's feet on the gravel of Park House, as she left for the last time, the crunch of footsteps walking away from a child who could not stop her. The sound, for Diana, of abandonment itself. She had spent her life in flight from that sound and the wound it left, marrying into a family that abandoned her in a colder and more total way than her parents ever had. And now she lay at the end of another long gravel drive, on her family's land, finally beyond the reach of everyone who had wanted something from her. The estate that had been the lonely landscape of her childhood became at the last the only place that could keep her safe. It is a hard kind of homecoming, the kind that comes too late to comfort anyone, and it closes the circle the story opened with. What followed across the years was the slow working out of all the consequences the adults had set in motion, and the first and most surprising of them was the rehabilitation of the 2 people the public had most blamed. Charles and Camilla, who in 1997 could not have appeared together in public without provoking fury, were brought back into the light by a campaign of extraordinary patience. Camilla was introduced to the public gradually, in carefully managed stages, allowed to be seen, then to be photographed, then to appear at Charles's side, the institution betting correctly that time and familiarity would do what argument never could. And it worked. On the 9th of April, 2005, Charles and Camilla were married in a civil ceremony at the Guildhall in Windsor, followed by a service of blessing, a wedding that would have been unthinkable a few years before, conducted with the quiet approval of a church and a public that had slowly made its peace. The woman who had been the most reviled in Britain became the Duchess of Cornwall, and set about a life of duty so unshowy and so steady that the loathing gradually wore away, replaced by something close to respect. The patience of that rehabilitation deserves to be understood, because it is the institution doing the one thing it does supremely well, so outlasting. There was no dramatic moment of public forgiveness, no single gesture that turned the tide. There was simply time, applied steadily, year after year, in small doses. A charity engagement here, a state occasion there, a gradual accretion of dutiful ordinariness that slowly buried the memory of the tapes in the headlines under a decade of quiet work. The institution understood, as it always had, that the public's fury is hot but not durable, that a new generation arrives that does not remember the worst of it, and that almost anything can be normalized if it is presented calmly and often enough for long enough. The same machinery that had failed so spectacularly to manage Diana's grief in the week after her death proved on this longer timescale ruthlessly effective. What it could not choreograph in days, it could engineer across years. By the time Charles came to marry the woman Diana had named, the country had largely stopped objecting, and by the time he came to the throne, the marriage that had once threatened to topple the monarchy had become one of its quietest assets. The succession that had once seemed so doubtful arrived in due course, as successions do. On the 8th of September, 2022, Queen Elizabeth II died at Balmoral after the longest reign in British history, and her son, the man at the center of the failed fairy tale, became King Charles III. The boy raised to weigh had waited longer than any heir before him, and the questions that had hung over him in the 1990s, whether a confessed adulterer could be crowned, whether he could ever marry Camilla, whether the monarchy could survive him, had all, by the time he came to the throne, quietly answered themselves. Camilla, the woman Diana had named as the third person in her marriage, was crowned alongside him as queen. It was an outcome that would have seemed impossible, even grotesque, on the day of Diana's funeral. That it came to pass is a measure of how completely the institution had absorbed and outlasted the scandal, and of how much can be forgiven or simply forgotten, given enough years and enough patient management. There is an irony in the succession worth pausing on, because the monarchy that survived into the new century was not quite the one Diana had married into, and the difference was largely her doing. The week of her funeral had taught the institution a lesson it could not unlearn, that the old code of distant, wordless dignity was no longer enough, that a modern public expected the family at the top of national life to show feeling, to be seen to grieve and to care, to come down from the balcony and walk among the crowds. In the years that followed, the monarchy quietly remade itself along lines Diana had drawn instinctively while she lived. Its members learned to embrace the sick and to speak about their own struggles, to talk openly of mental health, to perform the warmth she had performed so naturally and that the family had once regarded as undignified. Her sons, in particular, built their public lives on the emotional openness she had modeled, campaigning on exactly the kinds of human suffering she had championed. The institution that had found her impossible to manage in life spent the decades after her death becoming, in its public manner, more like her. It had defeated her in the narrow sense that it survived, and she did not. But it had also been permanently changed by her, made warmer and more vulnerable, and more human against its own deepest instincts, and that too was part of what she left behind. The two boys who had walked behind the coffin grew into men who embodied, more starkly with every passing year, the divergence that had been visible in them since childhood. William, the elder, the heir, did exactly what he had always seemed destined to do. He absorbed himself into the institution, married steadily, built a family and a public life defined by discretion and duty, and became in time the Prince of Wales, the same title his father had carried, the same title that had been the stage for so much of the tragedy. He had taken the lesson of his childhood and resolved to give his own children the stability he had been denied. Harry the younger, the spare, took the opposite path, and his life became, in its way, a long argument with everything his brother had chosen. He served in the army, including 2 tours in Afghanistan, finding in military life a purpose and a camaraderie that the role of spare had never offered him. He married the American actress Meghan Markle in 2018 in a wedding that seemed briefly to promise a glamorous modernizing of the monarchy. And then, in January of 2020, he and his wife stepped back from working royal life altogether and moved abroad, in a rupture that the press inevitably and not inaccurately compared to his mother's own war with the institution. He spoke, in the years that followed, of feeling that history was repeating itself, of watching the same machine that had hunted his mother turn its attention on his own wife, of a determination not to lose another woman he loved to the pressures of the role. Whether that reading was fair to his family or not, it was unmistakably his mother's son speaking. The same distrust of the institution, the same conviction that feeling mattered more than form, the same willingness to take his case to the public over the heads of the palace. The boy who was most like Diana, in his warmth, his anger, his hunger for love, his fury at the machine, had in the end done the thing she never quite managed and walked away. It would be too neat to say that the brothers simply became their parents, but the pattern is hard to miss. William took the path of the institution, as his father had, choosing duty and containment and the long game of survival, building his life as a refutation of the chaos that had marked his childhood. Harry took the path of the rebel, as his mother had, choosing feeling over form, refusing to absorb the slights and the silences, eventually using the press and the public stage to tell his own story in his own words. A memoir, interviews, a documentary series, exactly as Diana had once used a book and a television studio. The estrangement between the brothers that developed in these years was, in its way, the final inheritance of the marriage. The two boys who had stood together behind their mother's coffin, who had held each other up through the worst day of their lives, grown into men divided by the very different conclusions they had drawn from the same wound. One had decided the institution was worth enduring. The other had decided it was not. Both decisions were, at bottom, attempts to make sure that what had happened to their mother would never happen to them or to their children. And the tragedy was that those attempts had driven the brothers apart. The damage the adults did in the 1980s was still, 40 years on, rearranging the lives of the children, exactly as the deepest theme of this story always insisted it would. When the truth about the Panorama interview finally emerged in 2021, it was the two sons who spoke with the most force, and their words closed a circle that had been open for a quarter of a century. The inquiry's findings, and that the interview had been obtained through forgery and deceit, and that the broadcaster had covered it up, confirmed what their uncle, Charles Spencer, had long suspected and fought to prove. William said publicly that the deceit had worsened his parents' relationship and had contributed to the fear and isolation of his mother's final years, and that the interview should never be broadcast again. Harry connected it directly to the culture of exploitation that he believed had ultimately killed her. Two grown men, the boys from the funeral procession now in their late 30s, were still, decades on, fighting the same forces that had hunted their mother, still trying too late to protect her. It was the clearest possible proof of the thing this story keeps returning to, that the consequences of what the adults did in the 1980s and 90s did not end with Diana's death. They were inherited, like everything else in this family, by the children. Diana's afterlife and culture has been as restless and as contested as her life, and it began before she even died. Andrew Morton's book had already remade her public image in 1992. A television film dramatizing its revelations followed in 1993, turning the still-living princess's private suffering into broadcast entertainment almost in real time. After her death, the biographies multiplied. Sally Bedell Smith's careful study of a troubled woman, Tina Brown's panoramic account of the whole Diana phenomenon, each one a fresh attempt to fix in place a figure who refused to hold still. In 2017, a documentary built around the secret tapes she had recorded for Morton returned her own voice to the public, letting her narrate her story once more, 20 years after her death. And then there was the prestige drama, Netflix's lavish series about the royal family, devoted 2 of its seasons to the Wales marriage, with a succession of acclaimed actors playing Charles, Diana, and Camilla, turning the whole saga into glossy, sympathetic, enormously popular myth, watched by tens of millions who had never lived through the events themselves. A feature film imagined a single fraught Christmas at Sandringham as a claustrophobic psychological fable, its star playing Diana not as history recorded her, but as a trapped and luminous spirit. These retellings often captured the emotional truth of her story more powerfully than any chronology of dates, and at the same time risked replacing the real woman with a series of beautiful performances until it became hard for anyone to remember where the history ended and the myth began. This is perhaps the strangest part of Diana's afterlife, that she has become more legible as a character than she ever was as a person. The real woman was contradictory and difficult and not always wise, capable of manipulation as well as kindness, a brilliant instinctive performer who was also genuinely, helplessly compassionate, a victim of the institution who was also one of the most skilled players of the media game it ever produced. The myth has no room for those contradictions. The myth wants her either as the martyred saint hunted to death by a cruel family and a crueler press, or as the unstable schemer who nearly brought down the monarchy. And the truth, which is that she was a wounded and gifted woman caught in a machine too large for anyone to control, is harder to dramatize and easier to lose. Each retelling sends away another rough edge, simplifies another ambiguity, until the woman who actually lived recedes further behind the icon. What is worth holding on to, against all that smoothing, is the real person inside the legend. The 19-year-old who married for love and the 36-year-old who died being chased. Neither a saint nor a schemer, but a human being, which is both less and far more than a myth. There was, too, the long afterlife of suspicion, which never entirely died. The official inquiries had been exhaustive and their conclusions clear. The investigation into the conspiracy claims found no plot, and the formal inquest in 2008 returned its verdict of unlawful killing through gross negligence, naming the speed, the drink, and the pursuit. But for a great many people, the ordinariness of those findings was never enough to fill the void her death had left, and the theories persisted that she had been murdered by the establishment, that she had been silenced, that the truth had been hidden. One need not entertain these claims to understand why they endured. They endured because Diana had become by the end less a person than a vessel for public feeling, and the people who had poured their feeling into her could not accept that something so vast had been ended by something so small. The conspiracy theories were, in their way, a final tribute. The refusal of a graving public to believe that the most luminous woman of the age could be killed by a drunk driver and a concrete pillar, like anyone else, on an ordinary road in the middle of the night. What remains now in the summer of 2026 is a settled landscape that would have astonished the mourners of 1997. Charles is king, 77 years old. In the fourth year of a reign he waited his whole long life to begin. He has been treated for cancer since early in 2024, and at the end of 2025, the palace announced that his treatment would be scaled back in the new year, describing his progress as good enough to move into what it called a precautionary phase. Not a declaration that the illness is gone, but a quieter, more hopeful note than the one his reign began on. Camilla, the third person in the marriage Diana described to the nation, is his queen. William is Prince of Wales and heir to the throne, raising his own children at a deliberate distance from the machinery that consumed his parents, determined that they should have the childhood he did not. Harry lives abroad, outside working royal life. His relationship with his family strained, the rupture his mother began carried by her son to its conclusion. Kensington Palace, where Diana lived through the marriage and after it, remains an official royal residence, home now to William and his family. And Althorp still stands in Northamptonshire, where the Spencers have lived for 5 centuries. Diana's brother, Charles Spencer, now 61, still keeps the estate in the island grave, and in May of this year he married for the 4th time to an archaeologist in a ceremony in the Red Rocks of Arizona. The keeper of his sister's resting place, beginning himself another chapter. Diana herself, nearly 30 years gone, remains strangely present. Her face still sells magazines. Her sons still answer questions about her. Her style is still studied. Her charities still bear her influence. Her name is still invoked whenever the monarchy is accused of coldness or the press of cruelty. She has become a permanent reference point in British life, a measure against which the institution is still judged, an absence that somehow occupies more space than most living figures manage to. The island in the lake is quiet. The photographers cannot reach it. After a life lived entirely in the open, she rests, finally, somewhere no lens can follow. What this story reveals, in the end, is not that titles cancel feeling, but that they can make ordinary human failures catastrophic by surrounding them with symbolism and silence and duty until there is no room left for repair. Charles and Diana were not monsters or saints. They were 2 mismatched people, one too formed and one too young, married to satisfy an institution that wanted a beautiful picture more than it wanted two happy human beings, and the wreckage of that arrangement spread outward through tapes and books and confessions in a coffin moving through London, and settled, as it always does, on the children. There is no tidy lesson to draw from it, no moral that makes the waste worthwhile. There is only the long shape of the thing, a wedding sold to the world as destiny, a marriage remembered as damage, and at the end of it all, a small wooded island in the middle of an English lake, where a woman who was watched by the whole world for 16 years was finally laid somewhere she could not be seen.